So welcome. I'm Lauren Adler, the Chief Chocophile of Chocolopolis, and I know many of you, and some of you, I'm so glad you guys are here to join us today. Very excited to have Brett Beach from MIA joining us. Brett and I go back a long way. I think, I found photos of you doing an event at Chocolopolis in 2010, and I think we may have first met around 2009. Would that make sense?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, so we go back a long way in the early days of craft chocolate. So I really love what Brett is doing and what he's always done. It's been an important part of his mission. So Brett, I was hoping maybe you could go ahead and introduce yourself, but also tell us a little bit more about your background.
Sure, no problem. Nice to see you all, and thanks for spending your morning or evening with us. I know it's early for some, a little late for others, so it's good to have you all. So let's see, I think just briefly, my experience with Africa started in Peace Corps. So I went to Madagascar, ended up loving it, staying for another 4 years and working in different projects, development projects. And then when it was finally time to come home, which was to the US at that point, I'm American, I decided to do something that involved Madagascar. So I got involved in chocolate and did that for 10 years. And that was with the previous company, some of you might know, formerly called Madagascar. And then in 2016, I decided it was time for me to go my separate ways. And a year later, we decided to start MIA with my wife and a few other people. And so I guess, yeah, I've had the good fortune since I left Madagascar in 2006 of working in chocolate, vanilla, and keeping in contact going back almost yearly. Lauren and I did a test previously, a genetics test as well on cocoa, so we can talk about that. But I'll tell you a bit about what I do within MIA, but for now, I'll just say, yeah, co-founded it with my wife, some other people. I'm now here in Belgium. So my wife is from Bruges and I'm from the US/England. So it's all mixed up. So here we are. And yeah, we'll get into a lot of different fun stuff about Madagascar and cocoa and chocolate throughout.
That sounds great. I was also going to say, from just a housekeeping perspective, I've got everybody on mute right now. While Brett's talking, feel free to put questions in chat. We'll take pauses during the presentation when people are welcome to turn on their microphones, ask a question. But if you have questions while he's talking, put them in chat and we'll make sure we get to them when we make pauses. Sound good? Okay, I see heads nodding. All right, so without further ado, Brett, I think you want to show us a little video and we'll talk more about Madagascar, or sorry.
Yeah, don't worry.
I can't help myself, that's how I associate you. We'll talk more about MIA and we'll start our chocolate tasting as we're going through some of this.
Yeah, so one of the things I skipped over just now was that what MIA stands for is Made in Africa. And so we're part of the 1% of chocolate that's made into a chocolate bar in Africa. So that's a big part of what we do and what we communicate is the value we can add by doing that. So we thought the first thing would be to show you just some kind of the whole summary through video and then also some of the imagery.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and I would like to introduce you to a premium ethical brand that can change the world for the better. We founded MIA on the belief that the most delicious food products can also bring prosperity to communities in Africa. Our Made in Africa food concept is simple yet rare.
Having called Madagascar home for more than 6 years, it's a real pleasure to work with local communities to create a delicious product with positive social impact.
Here with MIA, the chocolate has been made as a high quality chocolate in Africa. So farmers are getting paid for their cocoa, workers in the factory are producing the chocolate, other suppliers locally are providing other ingredients, the sugar, the other services. And so all of their families come home with a livelihood out of this. And that's what we're involved with MIA. Great food that does good.
When I learned of MIA, I immediately understood it would be a great investment opportunity for social impact.
African farmers produce 65% of the world's cocoa, yet these communities do not even benefit from 1% of chocolate production. MIA chocolate made at origin creates 3 times more revenue than the purchase of fair trade cocoa alone. Premium chocolate is perfect for MIA because it is at the heart of our brand promise, amazing food that does good. The cocoa in Madagascar is truly unique because all of it is fine flavor, a classification that is only awarded to the top 10% of the world's cocoa. Farmers ferment and sun-dry their cocoa so the chocolate makers can bring the flavor to life in the roasting, grinding, and tempering.
Mia means made in Africa. It's the perfect brand name that works in many different languages. It has a meaning, it is evocative, it sounds lovely, and it just looks terrific on the pack.
The skills required to cultivate cocoa and craft delicious chocolate mean more jobs are created in Africa. This is our idea of amazing food that does good. Please join us on this incredible journey with Mia.
So I think, Brett, while you're looking for your next thing, I just wanted to say, Brett's always, for me, been able to make me understand a little bit better what it's like getting around Madagascar. I think you once said to me, how long does it take you to get to the cocoa growing region from, well, when you were in the US, how long did it take to get there? And how did you get there?
Yeah, so I was, when Lauren and I worked together, I was in where was I? In the Bay Area. And from there, it took 36 hours just to get to Madagascar. So you fly from San Francisco to DC, of course, a little layover, then to Senegal, get there in the morning, to turn on all the lights, spray the airplane for insects. Some families get on with crying babies. Then you fly to Johannesburg, South Africa, 4-hour layover. By that time, you're just kind of spinning. And then you fly over the beautiful Indian Ocean Channel, from South Africa to Madagascar, and that gets you to the capital. If you want to go see the cocoa farmers, the next day you get up, go back to the airport, and then inevitably the local airline has a lot of delays because they're all connected as it flies around the island. So if one flight's delayed, they all get delayed. So you get a delay, and then you fly up to northwest Madagascar. So you're in the center, you go up to the northwest, then you get a taxi to the port, you take your boat back to the big Madagascar from the little island, and then you get a taxi to the cocoa center, and then get on a motorcycle and you go to the cocoa farmers. And in between, on two sides of the port, there are like people heckling you, to take their boat and take their taxi, all that kind of stuff. So by the time you get there, and it's 35, let's say 80, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so really warm. And yeah, you stop thinking at that point, but it's really fun. And it's like, I would say it's really, you're so tired and so excited, but then at the same time, the water between the small island you fly to and Madagascar is just glass. And then you arrive and it's all hectic at the port. So it's like all these contradictions, but it's great. And that's how you get up there. And that's part of the region you saw in the video there. So the idea of Mia, we looked at other products actually. I thought, okay, we've done chocolate for 10 years before, let's start something else. And we looked at other nut butters and things. And so the idea of Mia is made in Africa. We want to do more than just chocolate, but something got us back to chocolate Madagascar. And we ended up launching the brand with that. So that's why we call it Food with Thought, because it's supposed to be making food, but making it in Africa, create jobs, and do it in a way that not many companies do, because not many things are made in Africa. We have great ingredients from Africa, but not many great products. Mostly South Africa, you have a few wines and spirits and things, and that's about it. You don't have many others. So that's our main purpose in terms of the higher purpose of the company. And the other thing that we believe is people don't really want to pay more just for a feel good. They want to pay more for quality. And so we try and work with the best ingredients possible. In Madagascar, we're blessed because that's, we said in the video, the country has 100% fine flavor cocoa. It's partly genetics, partly great farming, and partly great growing conditions. So we can talk about all that later. But it's just to say we're trying to deliver a great product that can compete, get awards, but also can do something quite different in terms of the impact that it delivers. Any questions, Lauren, that I know you wanted me to maybe, you want me to clarify anything?
Not yet.
All
Thumbs
right.
up on the video though.
Okay, great. So you saw in the video that we're at 3 times, then we were at 4 times the value of cocoa. Now we're actually at 5, because when we started the brand, we couldn't print the packaging in Madagascar. We weren't sure how to do it. Now we've got a good partner to do it. So now we're up to 5 times. We also started making cocoa butter. The factory started to make cocoa butter. So we kept adding more value. And so the whole message behind Mia is if people grow things They should be able to make things with them. And a perfect example of how upside down the world can be is I'm sitting in Belgium, great reputation for chocolate making, 11 million people, and makes 11% of the world's chocolate. Africa, 1.1 billion people, makes 1% of the world's chocolate bars. They make some semi-finished products, but chocolate bars, 1%. It happens that Belgium grows 0% of the world's cocoa and Africa grows 70. So you can start to see, we're not saying we're going to take every product back to Africa, but it should be more than 1%. So that's the whole message behind Mia. Let's fix this system that's a bit broken, and in the advantage of people who can actually work their way out of poverty and not have to take risky trips, especially here in Europe. You have people just trying to get a job, going to new places, going across the waters. And those are mostly people who are leaving home either from violence or because they need a job. They're not doing it just because it's fun. Let's say that. So that's a short summary. We have some really great things, I think, on cocoa, interesting pictures, but we want it to be more of a conversation, so we don't want to take it too far. Last thing is we do a One for Change program. So when we're working in Madagascar, we often see projects beyond the cocoa supply chain where we want to make a difference. So we said, as a practice, the company will set aside 1% of sales, and then we'll do impact projects. So we've just done a few projects like a school kitchen, some girls' scholarships, tree planting, and we can talk about those in more detail if those come up in questions.
Well, so I just wanted to, this is a lot of great information, and we're going to talk more about chocolate and cocoa, but I know we have a range of knowledge of people on the webinar. So I just wanted to say that when Brett talks about fine flavor cocoa, what does that represent about? Is that at like 8 to 10% of the world's production?
Last I saw from the report is 10%.
Yeah. So fine flavor cocoa, which is what we're talking about and what Madagascar has, represents 10% of the world's production. The other 90% is bulk market commodity cacao. So when Brett talks about paying more for quality, he's talking, as he mentioned, and we'll go into this more, about genetics, about the post-harvest processing, which includes fermentation, that I'm sure Brett will tell us more about. But if a farmer can, if they have access to the genetics, that's really helpful. Many of them don't. But if they then do a really good job of fermenting the cacao, they can make a lot more money. So I think that's a huge part of what you guys are trying to help the farmers with and produce quality. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and let's start tasting. We'll try our first bar before Brett keeps going. So again, we have a varying range of knowledge on the call. So I'm going to start at the beginning. So you all should have gotten your tasting card here and a flavor wheel. And what I always say about tasting is very personal. So what I taste may not be what you taste. There's really no wrong answers. The world of tasting in chocolate is not standardized, which the benefit of that is there's no wrong answers, really. Unlike wine, where you can study to become a sommelier, or coffee, where you could, specialty coffee, where you can study and take a test and become a Q grader, chocolate doesn't really have that right now. There is an international group working on standards in chocolate, and it is, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but to me it's surprisingly political. So someday maybe we'll have a standard, but we don't. So that's a long way of saying this flavor wheel is not meant to be intimidating. It's meant to be fun, and it's meant to, if you're tasting something and it reminds you of something and you don't know what it is, it's kind of fun to look on there and say, is there anything on here that kind of, reminds me of something? But if all of this just tastes like chocolate, that's fine too. This is just meant to be a fun tasting. So with that, I always like to start with the highest percent and work my way down to the lower percentages. So we're going to start with 100%. And, the percentage represents the percent cacao. So that means that the percentage, in this case, everything in here came from the cocoa bean. When we get to the 75%, for example, I'm assuming about 25% of that is going to be mostly sugar.
Yeah.
So the other 75 comes from the cocoa bean. So the percentage just tells you about how sweet the bar is. It's not going to tell you anything about quality. So let's go ahead and open this 100%. And I'll walk you through how I like to taste chocolate. I'm sure some of you have your own ways for doing it. We welcome feedback and other interesting ways if you want to put in your chat any tips that you all have for this. So you want to break off a small piece, and the first thing you want to do is look at it, right? Hopefully it's nice and shiny. That's what you're looking for. And hopefully, and then you want to have a nice snap. So break it in half. That was a nice snap. Means it's well tempered. And if you don't know what that means, come to one of my chocolate tasting classes. We'll go into that in detail. Rub it between your fingers under your nose and take small sniffs, because your sense of smell is a really important part of your sense of taste. If you were to plug your nose, you would not, the only tastes you would get from this are tongue tastes, which are bittersweet, salty, sour, and umami. It's the molecules that have scent to them that are actually helping you taste other things that are going up your nasal cavity as you taste. So smell is an important part. When you're ready, go ahead and put it in your mouth. Don't chew, just let the chocolate melt. Move it all around the inside of your mouth because you have taste buds everywhere. And what you want to think about as it's melting is, does it taste the same from the beginning to the middle to the end, or do the flavors kind of change as it's melting? So is it kind of a one-note chocolate where it's just one flavor the whole way out through, or is it more complex where you're noticing a lot of things? And then you'll think about the texture. Is it smooth and creamy? Is it chalky or gritty or something else? So I'm going to be quiet now and taste the 100%. And again, for this, if you guys want to put your comments in chat, that would be great.
What I would add to what Lauren said is that the 100% is like your espresso or your whiskey of chocolate. Sugar, obviously sweet, but it also gives more room for the cocoa to be a little, let's say, a little lighter on the cocoa. 100% is even, I say, it's much more powerful than eating a cocoa bean because cocoa beans are quite light. So you're going to get all of the Madagascar in there. I won't say what I think it tastes like. But this is, if you haven't eaten 100%, don't be surprised if your lips are puckering. Because,
but you know, that's the thing. I mean, I never thought I liked dark chocolate, right? And now I eat mostly dark chocolate. I never thought I'd say that, but I used to taste the 100% bars because I knew there were a lot of customers who wanted them, and I had to decide, you know, which bars we were going to bring into the store. So I'd taste them, and then one day I realized that I wanted some 100%. So like anything, your palate can get used to this. So it is a bar of chocolate, as Brett said, without sweetness. But I would say if you were to pick up a bar of Baker's chocolate that you probably baked with as a child, that would be a very different experience than this. This is to me, a very pleasant experience. We are getting a number of comments. So Steven says, it was bitter and a strong sour taste. Kayako says, I taste acidity. Manali says it's a pretty smooth for 100%. Steven's also getting some astringency. Rebecca says sour cherries. And Kim says, such a gorgeous bar. I was surprised how much of a brownie taste smell it starts out with. Wow, very creamy. I'm curious, Brett, if you can talk a little bit about the flavor profile from your perspective.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the acidity is right on because Madagascar is known as a fruity cocoa. And I think on the bitterness, as Lauren said, we taste it in a way. I think it does definitely, I wouldn't say it's not bitter, but I would say compared to if you took like an Ivory Coast cocoa, you would see that it's not on that far extreme of maybe where that cocoa might be because it is such a delicate cocoa. But compared to the others, it is much more powerful. And then there's a comment about astringency. So one of the challenges, especially with the 100, is at least what we do, and what I think a lot of chocolate makers would do is, so you have grinding where you're breaking down the cocoa and getting it smaller and smaller to around 20 microns. So it tastes smooth. That's our approach. Taza obviously has sandier chocolate on purpose. Then you're mixing it, and that's getting out the volatiles. And you'll see later if we look at the picture, but there's a vacuum on top of the mixer. So imagine a big tank going around. The key is to get to a point where you still have the nice acidity because you want a mouth-watering chocolate, but not astringency. So there's a balance, and that's where I'd say it's science and art. And so that's what they're trying to achieve, is not have astringency, but still have some acidity. If you go too long, you can pull off a lot of the flavor. But if you don't go long enough, you have some of the really strong flavors that are not welcome in cocoa, let's say in any chocolate bar. And I think the smoothness, especially if you compare it, if you're a 100% eater, would come from the fact that Madagascar mainly has Trinitario. So if we talked about coffee, Robusta, Arabica, this would be the Arabica of chocolate. It's a very gentle bean. It gets roasted for less time, and Madagascar is predominantly that bean. So that gives it, it's a much smoother tasting bean than the typical Forastero. You can have good Forastero beans, but a typical bean might be a little harsher, a little stronger than the Madagascar.
So Brett, we've had Sander and Kim both wanted to know if you're adding cocoa butter.
So now your bar, what we started to do is add a touch later. So so if you looked at if we went to the ingredients list, you would see it on, it should be, yeah, this is an updated version. So I don't have the same bar as you, but if you see it on there, then it's on. So we transitioned that. One of the reasons that we add a little bit is it's a little bit, can be so intense. But the good thing is the cocoa butter that we do add a touch of is it's made from Madagascar cocoa beans. So they're pressing cocoa and it's not deodorized. So it's got the flavors in it. As Lauren said, cocoa and cocoa butter, they're both from the same plant, same bean. So that makes the total cocoa content.
I'm curious. I always wondered about that. With most 100% bars, they only have one ingredient. Because it's 100%, do you have to list the cocoa butter separately?
Normally we would, but I don't know technically if you would have to. Yeah, I don't know the rule. We just do it because some people like to know, and just to put it on there transparently.
Yeah, and just to draw on your point about non-deodorized cocoa butter. So when most chocolate makers, although there's more doing what Brett was describing, when they're making a bar of chocolate and they decide to add extra cocoa butter, which you will know because it will be listed as a separate ingredient. Like the cocoa beans are made up of about equal parts cocoa butter and cocoa solids. So there's cocoa butter in the chocolate already. That's just the fat in the bean. But if there's an ingredient listed as cocoa butter, that means they're adding extra. But what Brett was referring to on the non-deodorized is a lot of chocolate makers will get deodorized cocoa butter that has no flavor to it. It's just really a fat, and they'll add that as the extra. What some makers are doing, which Brett is describing now, is pressing cocoa butter from the same origin and not deodorizing it. So it still has some of those flavors of that origin, and it's not really diluting the flavors as much. That's the idea anyway. Okay, let's see. We're getting some comments and questions, I think, coming in here. And hopefully everybody is paying attention to the chat because there's a lot going on over here. Let me just see if we have any questions. Yeah, the bar we have does not list cocoa butter separately. Richard's pointing that out. Okay, and I think you answered the when did you change the recipe and why question already. I had a question for you, Brett. I've noticed recently that, for me, Madagascar always does have those kind of red fruit and citrus, like very, very acidic notes to it that I love. And like if I get a milk chocolate lover and they're willing to try dark chocolate, I usually try to steer them to Madagascar because it doesn't have the bitterness that I think many associate with dark chocolate. But I've noticed recently, every batch of chocolate is different. And I've noticed some of the chocolates being made with cacao from Madagascar are not nearly as fruity as they were. And I'm wondering how global warming, recent harvests, if the flavor of the cacao has been changing, if you've noticed that, or if maybe that was just a maker doing something different.
Yeah, well, I don't know if impacts from global warming. Madagascar harvests year round, which is a bit different than Ghana, which is really two hard stops, two crops per year. But what I would say is in Madagascar, I've been to different areas and the cocoa is markedly different. So you have certain areas of that's called the Sambirano Valley, where there is more forastero. And that it just gives it's a stronger, a bit more pungent taste when you eat the beans just dried. So it depends where they're getting it from. Then the second thing I think, besides where the cocoa is from in Madagascar, in the cocoa growing region, which is not that big, and that's genetics. Let's call that just genetics, because I don't think it's linked to the actual soil. It's the cocoa bean genetics. But the second thing is how the farmers cure. So about 80% of cocoa that leaves Madagascar is not properly fermented. It's still really good cocoa, so you can still make pretty good chocolate out of it. And then you have about 20% that is properly fermented and dried, and that just develops a much better bean. We'll show you some things later to explain why. So I'd say that's the second part that could explain these differences. And if you don't get that fermentation, then you're fighting, it's an uphill battle.
So can you talk a little bit more about the genetics right now? Because I didn't even realize there was forastero there. I thought it was mostly going to be the Criollo type. And if so, where is it coming from?
Sure. And let me just see if I can pull up some other.
While you're pulling that up, I'll tell the story. So the United States Department of Agriculture and Mars, the candy company, had started this cacao genome project in 2008, I believe. Was it 2010 when you did the genotyping of the cocoa beans in Madagascar?
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So I remember that they were I think the purpose of this project was more for the big companies to figure out more productive trees, maybe some flavor, whatever. But Brett, for the fine chocolate segment of the industry, was going to Madagascar. So I think you said the USDA gave you like plastic bags with silica powder in them, and you're like flying to
Yeah.
Madagascar with what looks like cocaine. You could talk about that a little. It was pretty funny.
Yeah, I thought it was ironic because I got it from, we were in touch with somebody who's been in the industry a long time, Ed, and then somebody else from the FDA, and they sent us these packages, and it was, yeah, really looked like cocaine. So I thought, okay, this is strange, because normally you come the other way, you know, from like developing nations, sending it to the wealthier nations where they're buying. So I was going backwards with it, but I also know Madagascar, luckily I was in Peace Corps. So when you get there, and then you speak some of the language, people kind of go, oh, and then they're generally pretty nice to you at customs. But I thought, on the odd chance they want me to open my bag, this is going to be a tough one to explain. But I did get through. And I think one of the things that was really interesting is the farmers knew which cocoa varieties there were, at least most of the time we noted down, and then we marked the trees, and later we got the results. So it was quite fascinating that they would know by the leaves, the cocoa pods, the production, the productivity between the differences. And Lauren's right, there's predominantly Trinitario Criollo, but with cocoa, it's cross-pollinating. And so there is some Forastero there. From what we see, I think in the genetics, when we got those from the farms, there was an overwhelming, you know, fine flavor, genetic even. Madagascar is considered fine flavor in general because it all gets bunched together, but even the genetics were overwhelming.
Well, I think what you said when she was presenting this to the Fine Chocolate Industry Association at one of our meetings, and I recall you saying that, you know, Madagascar is a former French colony, right? And the French have a very long tradition of very good chocolate. And and I think Brett said, leave it to the French to bring the good stuff over to Madagascar. So they brought the good genetics from South America over.
So the thing that Madagascar is blessed with is that it's an island, so it's isolated. So some of the good cocoa also reached mainland Africa, but the problem there, they have quite a lot of disease in the cocoa diseases for cocoa trees with fungus and stuff like that. And Madagascar, they haven't had those issues. It's also not a mass market crop. So it's not really a plantation crop, monocropped. It's a lot of intercropping of other things, pineapple, bananas, spices, where it is in Ivory Coast and Ghana, it's taken to a level of, you know, big farm in a lot of places, big farming. And so it's just more of a natural forest. And I've never seen anybody use pesticides in Madagascar. Long story short, the really good cocoa survived and lives till today. And so Madagascar, in the kind of smaller chocolate world of craft chocolate and people who know chocolate, is one of the top countries, if not the top, if you just took a vote. And that's how the vote ended up going that way for the Fine Chocolate Industry Association. Sorry if this gives you a little bit of, makes you dizzy, but I'm just trying to get forward to the...
we do have a question, if I could kind of back. Lindsay wants to know that she said recently she's learned there's been issues with fermentation in the Caribbean, a change in the microbiome. Is there any of that occurring in Africa?
So that I haven't heard of from Madagascar. I wouldn't, from the other countries, I just wouldn't know yet because we don't work in Ghana or Ivory Coast as of today making chocolate. We just make it in Madagascar. And the farmers that we're working with aren't having any issues, but it doesn't surprise me. I was telling in another presentation, you know, the Bay Area is really well known for sourdough bread, and that's partly the air, what's in the air, and what mixes and works the yeast in the air that work on the dough. And it's similar in Madagascar. The bacteria and the yeasts are going to ferment the cocoa. And so that would, I can imagine that having an impact, but we haven't seen it in Madagascar. This just shows, Lauren can explain, but this just shows a variety of beans, well fermented and not so well fermented. And then also you can see the different colors, and this is after being dried. So they're showing the different varieties of cocoa.
Yeah, so I think your point, Brett, earlier was that you can see the variety of color in these beans. So can you talk a little bit about purple versus white for the group?
Yeah, so this is actually from an area, this cut test is from an area where there is a lot more Forastero, which is more of the common bean that grows more in mainland Africa. And so you can see here the darker colors would be more associated with that. The really white would be called Criollo. And then in between, you would have a Trinitario, which is a hybrid. As you can see from this, it's as mixed as humanity. So it's not just really three different colors. It's all blended. But for simplicity, we always talk about three. but within science, there are a lot more cocoa beans than that. And then when we're talking about fermentation, so this would be an example of a kind of a marbled bean, which is not good. It hasn't been worked through well. This is a well-fermented bean. So these beans like this can give your chocolate a bitterness, and there would be a threshold of 1% when you do a quality control test with the farmers. And if you see beans like that, it's good. Other things you want to keep out, obviously sticks and rocks. So you have a threshold for that kind of thing, but then also moldy beans, flat beans. So these are all going to give, like any food you make, if you have some rancid nuts and you put them in your snack bar, it's not going to taste the same. And it's the same with cocoa. So you want to get that as low as possible and ideally eliminated.
I'm curious, Brett. I've always wondered about what you were calling marbled. I mean, the slaty marbled. I don't know if they're the same thing, but does that come from a bad bean to begin with, or is that a bad fermentation issue? Like, where does that happen?
That's the fermentation.
Okay.
Yeah. So the fermentation, I don't know, Lauren, if you wanted, and tell me when you want to taste the next bar, but we can, depending on what you want for the group, we can go through briefly the process so people understand we're not just jumping around, but if it's more people who just want to ask a question, then we don't have to, because it's kind of broken up into cocoa cultivation, cocoa curing, so after we harvest it, and then chocolate making for us, because we make the chocolate there as well.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Let's taste the next bar and then let's go forward with fermentation and anything else on the processing you'd like to share. I think that would be great.
Okay.
So now we're going to do the 75% bar. So moving into the bars that have some sugar added, I'm going to cleanse my palate with some warm water here. I know at the International Chocolate Awards, when we're judging, we actually have to use soupy polenta as our palate cleanser, which at first I was like, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. But apparently it neutralizes the pH in your mouth and actually works pretty well. And it was not as filling as I thought it would be. As I thought, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to taste hundreds of bars of chocolate and eat polenta, but it has not been that bad. I can't complain. I'm judging chocolate. How could I complain, right? All right, so now you know what to do. Remember, use all 5 senses. So break off a piece. I'm gonna look at it. Hopefully it's nice and shiny. Listen to that snap. Rub it between your fingers under your nose. Take some sniffs. Make sure you get lots of aroma there. And then go ahead and taste, but don't chew. It was funny. My mother is like the chew police, and so she'll go up to people like, "Don't chew." And I was in New York, and there was like a French company, I think, with a kiosk behind the New York Public Library, and I think it was called like "Don't chew your chocolate" or something.
So I think just generally, I mean, obviously Lauren started with the right bar in terms of tasting, but even if you don't love the 100, it's a great way to set the table, and then other things taste so sweet, after that. So I'm always shocked how sweet the 75 tastes after the 100.
Yes, Rebecca says so sweet. And I know 100%. We when I had Chocolopolis, we've had a lot of people who love 100% bars. So I know it's always going to be a crowd pleaser with many people in the group, although not all of them. But it is, Madagascar, as Brett was saying, I think is a very approachable chocolate in general. So for me, 100%, if I'm going to start somebody out on their first 100% bar, I always would head to Madagascar if we can find something there.
I would also say if you're 100% is not much to hide behind. So you will see there, I don't want to name names because it's not, there is a really big company that does a 99% and it's pretty tough to eat. So it's a good way to judge a brand and what cocoa they're using. Of course, some brands are using different origins, but if you have, if they have 100%, you'll get a good sense of just the flavor of the cocoa because there's not much more there. The roasting obviously plays a role, but you can't hide behind the sugar and the raspberry, liqueur and all that. It's just cocoa.
So we're getting some comments. I'm trying to taste and talk. Probably not the best chocolate tasting practice, but do as I say, not as I do. There we go. That's what my dad used to always say. Very effective child raising technique. Let's see. Tracy says sweet and a bit sour. Kayako says I can taste apricot or plum. Kim says, and now I know my perception of fruit and cherry flavors is associated with sugar. Such a great contrast. And Sandra, it has a nice development. Yeah, I'm actually getting some, for me, Madagascar is usually kind of screaming red fruit, but I'm totally the apricot and plum in this, and then I'm getting some maybe nut notes as well. Carolyn says nutty and sour cherry, interest continues. I'm tasting more than one piece.
I think it's a good, because I always describe it as more of kind of the raisiny, but I think apricot plum for me is really, at least what I feel compared to the other bar, which we'll see when we get to the baobab bar. That it's,
oh, go ahead.
no, just it's I agree. It doesn't have the super typical what you might expect in a Madagascar 75.
I mean, it's still very acidic, which I expect from Madagascar. It's just a little bit different acidity, I think. Or, yeah. Let's see. Manali says, yeah, I'm getting nut too, not the usual red fruit I was expecting. We've got some agreement on the nutty element. Diana says it starts off really bright. That might be in contrast to the 100%. Okay, lots of great comments coming in here. Okay. So maybe we could go back and you could talk through fermentation and just kind of the process for you guys in Madagascar that's unique to you. And I think, you've got such great photos and on the ground experiences. It's fun to hear about those as well.
No problem. So what I'll try and do, I'll go a little bit fast, but not too fast because I know there'll be questions. So the idea is that I don't talk too much, but then we leave time for questions. I would say, roughly speaking, we're looking to add value in two ways. One is to work with farmers who can ferment and sun dry, because what's happening is if they're selling cocoa freshly out of the pod to a collector, two things go wrong. One is the farmer doesn't get as much money because they're not curing it. And the second is it doesn't get cured normally very well by the collector because they don't get it to the curing in time, or they're just not interested. They just want to export a certain amount of beans. And then the shame of it all is that then you have cocoa leaving Madagascar that's not doing as well as it could. It's not realizing its potential. So we work with cocoa farmers who can add value, and that's through some equipment that I'll show you. And then secondly is through the chocolate making process, the skilled jobs, the packaging, the printing, the boxes, all those inputs that come in that are created in Madagascar. So cocoa, I'd say, is environmentally friendly in the sense that it grows under a shade tree, and it is a tree. So you're seeing the little cocoa trees here at the bottom. This is entering the Sambirano Valley from the little mini port when you come across. For about 4 months from flower to pod, pollinated by the wind, little ants, little insects. And within a pod, you can have any number of different beans because it depends where the pollen's coming from. So it's quite cool in that way. If you take a fresh pod as a test and you cut it in half and slice beans, you can see different beans in there. So
just to clarify, you mean different genetics. So one pod can have multiple genetics in it, which is really cool.
Yeah. And well, they're harvesting with the long stick called la gaffe, and they basically just pull it off the tree, either catch it or it falls on the soft forest floor, but they know it's ready because when you shake it, it's a little bit, the pulp has gone in a bit, so it rattles a bit. So you know it's ready. And there you can see in the lower left, the insert, those beans are about 1 gram each. So I say chocolate is a real luxury because about 2 pods make a bar. You get about 2 kilos, so maybe 5 pounds from a tree. And most people eat more than 5 pounds. So the typical person is claiming 2 cocoa trees somewhere in the world per year, and let's say in wealthier nations that can afford to eat chocolate. So it's a luxury in that way, and takes a lot of work, obviously. So that gets you there. They've harvested it. The other key when we're talking about fermentation with farmers having the equipment is that you only have 8 hours max to put it properly and ferment it in a big batch. Otherwise it starts to go off because it ferments by itself. So this gets us to the point where these are some cocoa farmers I met on the road when I was coming back from a farm visit, and they were preparing their cocoa to sell fresh. So they would get up to 40% less for their crop. And what you see on the right here, this cocoa and the background, that's in its pulp. So a little bit fruity, little sour, and the beans inside, they would sell that to a collector. So they break the pod out and sell the beans. So they're missing out on the added value of fermentation and drying. and the cocoa's normally not going to realize its potential.
And can I just add something to that? The pulp, if you haven't had the pulp, as Brett said, it's very sweet and tart. It's kind of like reminds me a little bit of eating lychee. It's a very sweet and tart, but it's a really important part of fermentation. It's very high in sugar content, and you can't ferment the cacao without that lovely pulp.
There's nothing in fermentation except cocoa and pulp, cocoa beans and pulp. So no added anythings. So that gets us to the curing. So you can imagine some farmers have sold already. They're out of this. This isn't it. Do you want me to keep going a bit, Lauren, before we taste the other bar?
Yeah, please do.
So we'll get to the end of cocoa and then we'll taste the other bar. So this is what we do. There were some development projects from the World Bank where they got buy-in from the farmers. Farmers give the sand, borrow some money. The bank brings in some money for materials. And what they're trying to do in Madagascar is they were trying to standardize a higher quality. So they're saying, let's get this, we'll call it technology, out to farmers, because if they don't have it, they can't use it. So you really need two things to make great cocoa besides the training. You need a certain volume, because fermentation normally is about 1 ton or 2,000 pounds of fresh cocoa that goes in, and about 700 comes out as dry. So if you look at the back there, those stair steps, those are fermentation boxes. And each one gets about 2 days. And mixing is important during the process because it introduces oxygen and keeps the fermentation as an acidic fermentation. Otherwise it goes to a lactic fermentation. The drying as well is about 6 days. This also takes some precision to make sure that all the gases can come out of the cocoa beans and then that they can develop the precursors to good chocolate. But if you just eat a cocoa bean, it tastes nutty, but it doesn't taste like chocolate to me. That comes from the roasting and the grinding and all that, and the sugar. So on the right is the technician who helps the farmer who's installed one of these units. Most farmers don't have this, and this is the reason they can't get that extra value.
And Brett, so Lindsay wanted to know if you're drying exclusively on the ground.
Yeah, in Madagascar, there are some, I think Akison sometimes does some drying with heat from fires, but I'm not sure now, so let them speak to that. But most of the farmers in Madagascar, they're not using greenhouses or anything. It's on typically on cement, just to keep it clean and dry. So here what you see is in the insert, that's more fermented, so it'd be kind of like warm baked beans, gets to about 50 degrees centigrade. So I think like 110 Fahrenheit, it's quite hot. And then on the left, that's actually, a door has been removed. And this is when they would dump the beans down into the next box, but they're still so firm that they're not falling. So it will be in the first days of fermentation, probably the first box. So they basically opened the hatch, and before they pushed the beans out, they've taken a picture to show. By the end, a lot of the moisture is dripped out or evaporated, and then they go out to the drying area. And the goal in drying is to get to about 8% humidity content. And the lady on the left is raking. So they're over those 6 days, they're turning them constantly to make sure they get evenly dried. And then they're also sorting, because one of the big things like coffee and cocoa is if you have flat beans, beans that are too small, it should be really consistent. Otherwise, when they roast them, they will burn some and under roast others. So that happens again at the factory, but they're sorting at the farm to get out any sticks or any foreign matter, and to look for any flat beans would be put aside. Those would be typically in the big chocolate industry. Those would be shipped out to make cocoa butter. You know, they'd still smash them and get the butter out.
What do you guys do with the flat beans? Make the cocoa butter?
No, we're using just normal, the same beans are used to make the butter and the chocolate. These would get taken out at farm level. And I'm not sure what the farmers do, if they sell them as, lower grade. I know in Ivory Coast, those are sold off season to make cocoa butter. So exactly what you said, the lower grade. This we already saw. But if you look, when you see the cocoa here fresh, you can already see the genetics. So you would see, and in some you can see, if you look at a close-up, you can see these are slightly different colors. So they're slightly different beans. But then when you look at all these that are dried, you can really see it. It gets bagged up. This is a farm with about 40 hectares, so pretty big, but family farm. So, one of the few to have a tractor, but a lot of them are taking it in ox carts. So they would bag it up and then take it to, it's called a regional capital, but it has a bank and a post office and a paved road through the middle. And then that would go on a truck to the chocolate factory, about 13 hours away if there's no flood. Otherwise, some waiting.
Is it going over ground or sea as well?
Yeah, ground. It could go by boat, but I don't think that's very much of a route that people take, but it is possible. But this goes over.
And Tana is where you make the chocolate, right?
Exactly. So it goes from sea level to about 3,000 feet, 1,000 meters.
And cooler where the chocolate's being made.
Much cooler, yeah. More like, I would say kind of, I don't know, maybe like a Utah type temperatures, a little cooler than that, but it's a nice climate. That's where I lived for my Peace Corps in a couple of years. So I got around a little bit and got to see different places. So that sums up the cocoa, but I think now I'll pass it to Lauren for the next tasting. And then also if there are questions about cocoa farming, we should go into those. And then later I can go into the chocolate making.
Yeah, if you have a question, go ahead and turn on your microphone. But before we do that, let's taste this bar and then you can ask questions. So hold that thought. And maybe, Brett, could you talk about the baobab trees?
Yeah, sure. So Madagascar actually has 6 of the 8 world's baobab trees, or baobab, and they say actually there's a myth or something that says God punished them and flipped them upside down because they don't have leaves most of the year and they just roots sticking out. They look like roots, but it's the branches. And then they flower and the pods grow, and it's the only fruit in the world to dry on the tree. So it's considered a superfood. It's super high in vitamin C. I think about 3 or 4 times pineapple and orange. And it's a little bit, people describe it as a little bit sherbety or zingy. And it's a dry powder. So a lot of foodies, people interested in superfoods would put it in a shake. We've put it in the chocolate. We haven't put too much. We put about 2%, which is quite minimal. But otherwise the chocolate would get dry. And also with Madagascar already being fruity, adding a fruity superfood, it would get more like a lemon probably in the end or something, a little bit too much.
I just want to point out in the video, I think it was, or somewhere I saw a beautiful photograph of them putting the cacao nibs on the back of this bar, how beautiful this is. And for those of you who have not had cacao nibs, this is what Brett was talking about earlier. These are just pieces of the roasted bean before they're turned into chocolate, and they're going to probably taste more nutty. Well, because it's Madagascar, they may have more of a acidic sour note to them, but the nibs often taste kind of nutty. So that's what's on the back of the bar.
I like try and get some of the cocoa nibs, and I love tasting this bar because it gives you the basics, which like Lauren said is just the cacao nibs, and then it's I'd say the fun of having a little bit of salt and also 65% dark, so you get a little more sweetness. So I'll let you.
And you are allowed to chew when it's an inclusion bar. You kind of have to.
Another great way to learn about companies, if they do put their cocoa out on the table, if you ask, if it's okay to try, it's roasted, you can get it out quite easily, but it's to try the cocoa because Madagascar is quite clean. Some are more bitter, some are, they all just have different flavors, but it all starts with the cocoa. So you can learn a lot about.
And Brett, can you clarify something you said earlier? Did you really mean that there are no pesticides anywhere in Madagascar, or just the trees that you work with?
I have never seen any in all the time I've been there and all the farms I've visited.
That's great.
It is possible, but I think part of the reason is they just don't have that many issues with its cost, to be honest, as well, probably for the farmers. So it's not needed and it's an extra cost. And it's lucky, it's great. And I've never heard of anybody, for example, the cocoa we work with is certified organic. We just don't have the full certification for the bar. In the past, when I worked, we wouldn't have had any issues getting certified organic for the cocoa. So.
Okay, and so that somebody also asked about, it was Rebecca, did they use fertilizers at all?
Not only organic. Some of them put their pods around the trees. And then when the trees are growing, I wouldn't say it's a fertilizer, but one of the practices is grow banana palms over them until they're a certain age, and then they would cut down the banana palms, and then the trees are big enough, and they're still under shade trees. So they have a technique, but they're using mainly the cocoa, and then sometimes they might use the cow dung because a lot of them might have cattle to work the fields, and also just for other reasons if they have rice fields and things.
Okay, we're getting some tasting comments over here. Sandra feels the baobab overwhelms the cocoa. Diana says it's lemony. Manali is getting more red fruit with this one, a bit of a citrus zing at the end. And Manali would like to know, Brett, do you use Trinitario beans for all your bars?
So I would say yes, but it's blended. It's a blended mix. And so it's what we would look at there, what you have predominantly in the forest is what you get, but it's rare. The only ones I know of in Madagascar that have truly isolated is Akison has, they say I think about 1 or 2 tons, which is not a lot for a whole country, of Criollo. And I might slip on this, but it's maybe about 200 feet or so that you have to provide between those trees and the other trees, otherwise the pollen will go in the wind. So you really have to isolate cocoa to ensure it's really one genetic, and know that you've planted that there. So one of the big things in Madagascar as well is what gets produced as a seedling and then distributed or sold to farmers, because it's in everybody's interest to keep the good stuff going and minimize, any forest arrow.
So Kayako says so many different flavors in one. She tastes strawberry. Ella, blackberry up front for her. Kim asks, she knows you've been intentional about sourcing everything locally. Are you able to also source local sugar, or maybe more generally, what have been the biggest challenges to source locally?
So sugar, yes, whenever possible. So Madagascar has a net shortage of sugar. So whenever we can, we buy there. Sometimes it has to be bought. It's bought in the country still from a local supplier, but sugar comes from Brazil mostly when it's not from Madagascar. And that's just because they can't produce enough for their own consumption. Similar issue with rice in Madagascar. They grow it, but they don't grow enough. I think the biggest challenge, some things just aren't grown there. And we had to make a decision. So for example, on almonds, it's a really, maybe not with super purists who just want a dark bar, but in general public, a lot of people like nuts and chocolate. But our decision was, our goal is to create jobs to get lift MIA up and benefit the supply chain. So if we bring in 5% almonds for a bar, we can accept that. We have a minimum value add. So a minimum 65% of our production cost has to be from Africa. And then other things can come from outside, which is quite common. Some countries, it would be probably 95 or 100% inputs coming from outside. So I'd say the nuts are a challenge. The packaging was a challenge, but now we've transitioned. So now the packaging is printed there, which is quite a big value in terms of a chocolate value. And the nuts just don't go there. So it's either you do it or you don't. But it is.
You mentioned the packaging earlier. What did you have to do? I mean, what was missing and what did you have to do to make that transition on the packaging side?
We had to adapt a bit. And to be honest, early on, the local printer had made kind of a bid, but I think they just weren't getting it right for what we'd done. So we adapted a bit and they improved a bit. And then we got there. So there's some finishes that's quite technical, but they're not so good at, if you look at the upper left corner of your bar, there's like a high UV gloss that's supposed to be kind of subconscious almost at it. And then lower right. And if I grab the bars from now, if I have one, just to show, we switched it out a bit. So we took that away and then we put in this gold down here. And this is just printed now. So we've eliminated it, tried to keep the feel. And little things, but when it's your brand or your company, you have to think quite long about all these little things and how they might get somebody to pick it up. Once people like chocolate, I think they think less about packaging, but I think in the beginning, it's pretty important.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I think, having been a retailer, the packaging definitely sells it the first time. What's inside will sell it the second and third time, but the packaging makes a huge difference in getting brand recognition and getting people to try your chocolate, I think. So yeah. Tracy wants to know, how long do you grind the cacao?
So it's a bit of a mix. So that's actually a great question. I'll tell you now and then we'll show you. But in the way the cacao is prepared is it goes through one roller. So big rollers that crush it and get it to about 180 microns, so still really quite rough. And then it gets ground for 2 to 4 days, depending. Mostly 2 days, but then the 100% goes longer. And I say ground/mixed because the grinding is reducing the particle size and the mixing. But in chocolate, especially for say mid-sized craft chocolate, you have what's called a universal, and it grinds and mixes. So these terms get a little bit mixed up.
When you say mixing, what's the process happening there? Is it the cocoa butter and the sugar like combining, or versus the grinding?
So normally the mixing that I'm talking to happens after all the grinding, and it's just to get the volatiles out and to get that flavor developed, but it's not grinding the cocoa at all. If you can imagine, so your food processor is the grinder, so to say, and then stirring is the mixing, and stirring is just stirring. You're not breaking down the recipe
So
anymore.
similar to the conch, but without the particle size and grinding part.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or if you're in a conch and you're pulling the because they're kind of, if you think of a jet engine, a big jet engine with the blades, that's basically what a conch looks like on the inside. And as it goes through the process, the blades get closer and closer to the sides, so the cocoa gets forced into a smaller place and crushed. But if you pull those blades back, you can just use it as a mixer. It's not crushing it anymore, it's just mixing it.
Okay. Richard would like to know, how old do the cocoa trees grow and for how long are they productive?
You have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but normally cocoa, about 4 years it produces, after 4 years old, and it's most productive up to around 25, but can go up to around 40 years. But normally it declines in terms of productivity, maybe not quality, but that's about the range.
Steven says the texture makes it fun to chew, which gives a real explosion of flavor. This bar will not last long enough. I'm having that same experience. I'm sitting here eating this bar a lot. Stephen would like to know, how do you keep the chocolate from melting during shipment? That's the $1 million question.
Yeah. So
literally $1 million.
Yeah. So the chocolate quite simply it's temperature controlled from the time it leaves the grinder. So when it gets molded, put in the plastic molds, polycarbonate, and then into the cold tunnel until it gets to the store. And in a really good supply chain, and in smaller craft, people will use UPS and time it right, and that's fine. But if you go through a bigger chain where delivering to Whole Foods or something, it would be temperature controlled. So it's quite standard. I've heard of some people shipping by boat without, but not many, and you would have to really secure a place at the bottom of the boat. Otherwise, from a tropical climate to anywhere else, your chocolate will be ruined.
Okay,
Yeah.
we have a lot of questions and comments here, so let me hang on, let me just see what we've got. So Rebecca says she thinks it's fantastic that you've managed to bring the packaging in country too. Well done. Manali loves the packaging, particularly on the 65%. And hang on, Ella, I'll come back to you. Sandra says, yes, I'm very impressed about being able to produce the packaging in Madagascar since it's a sorely underdeveloped country. Oh, Diana is eating a little bit of the 100% with the 65%, and so it's very good. I'm going to ask this question of Kim Wilson, and then Ella, I'll come back to you. Ella wants to turn on her microphone and ask a question. But before we go there, Kim is asking, is that the most expensive part of your supply chain, the cold chain?
No, the most money we would spend is on the cocoa. If you're talking about inputs. So I can't compare with an ambient container, but it costs money to use a cold container. But I think just shipping in general. So when you're shipping cocoa, it's quite voluminous because it's not ground down, and that has to leave Africa. Or if you're shipping chocolate, it's more condensed. So it's one or the other. But cocoa is the most expensive part of our production costs. Say Latin, the cost from Africa getting to a warehouse somewhere.
Okay, Ella, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, sorry. I'm curious why you aren't using more inclusions that are native to the country. A lot of chocolate makers are doing that, and there's a lot of interest in in chocolate people in trying the native nuts and fruits and that kind of thing. And I know some chocolate makers that make the chocolate within country are using a lot of those things, which there's a lot of interest in. So are there native nuts and fruits that could be used there?
Yes, that's a good question. Actually gets at some of the issues. So I know if you take an example that I know of, Omnom out of, I think that's the Icelandic, they use a lot. Now, so one issue facing Madagascar, at least, and I think a lot of African countries, is you have a great coconut, you can go to the beach, can drink it and then eat it. But if you are a chocolate maker and you say, where can I find this, where people can lab test it, make sure there's no microbial matter in it, bacteria, that's hard to do because there's no demand, or because they have some free trade agreement and other countries are so sophisticated that they've been able to produce it much lower cost, and the locals never can really raise up and compete on an industrial level. That's one issue, and that's a big issue in Madagascar. The second challenge is I guess the market you target, because I totally agree with you, and I think we've tried to do some things, although it wasn't necessarily with a local agreement. We have a kind of a more oddbar, like the hemp and almond, hemp seed. And
I've had that.
Yeah. Okay. So I was inspired by a mushroom bar I tasted, and I think the omegas bring that flavor a bit, but it is sometimes harder. I think if you don't have a really local market, like imagining a farmer's market or a shop, it's harder sometimes to get that out and get people to try it. So that's one of the challenges I have. We don't really have a home court. So I'm in Belgium, we work in Madagascar, talking to Lauren in Seattle. So we don't have, whereas some companies really build up through that local audience that can spread the word or a store. But I think the main one for us is the processing in country. However, to bring a positive answer to your question, if I can find it. Here it is. So this is our newest bar, and that's what we're trying to do increasingly because operationally it's much easier, but this is our cashew ginger spice. So this is coming out in the fall. The cashews are from Madagascar, the ginger's from Madagascar, and the vanilla and most of the spices are vanilla, cinnamon, that kind of thing. And so it makes sense for value add, it makes sense for logistics across the board. But cashews, you might not say, oh, this is some of the things that are really typically Madagascan are they have a really hot pepper called Cacao. And then they have jackfruits. Lychees are quite well associated with Madagascar. And then they have other tropical fruits that you would find in other countries. And vanilla is a big one, of course. But that's not so well seen in dark chocolates, at least. Milk chocolate's more popular. So.
Great.
So Lauren, to follow up on that, what do people do that are making chocolate in other countries that use inclusions? Are they running into the same issues, or because we see a lot of native inclusions coming out of a variety of countries? Lauren, that was for you.
Oh, I don't know, Ella. I assume that as Brett said, I think it depends on the country, right? And I'm going to guess, Brett, correct me if you have a different opinion, but I'm going to guess that in South America, there's probably more local industry around some of those, like what he was talking about with the FDA stuff. And actually, Kim Wilson's on here and could probably, that's a side conversation. I don't want to get us off track here, but Kim would be a good person to ask that question on the side. But I think I'm going to guess that they probably have a lot more industry around certifying and processing the other ingredients than many of the countries in Africa do. That would be my guess.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I've been to other countries, but actually working in the way in Madagascar is one of the 20 poorest countries, which means, without getting into all of why, just there's not much buying power. And so you don't get a lot of premium products. Most people spend about 75% of their wages on food. I think in the US it's around 10. I know in the Netherlands it's 10. So most developed countries, we're spending 10%, they're spending 75%. They're just basically buying rice, sugar, oil, and some beans.
Well,
so that creates an economy where you're not really got a lot of other things flowing through, special occasions, some biscuits, some Coca-Cola, New Year's, Christmas, but otherwise it's pretty much just trying to be healthy and get the basics.
I'm curious, Brett, that actually makes me think of something else as we're having this discussion is, it is made in Africa. Are there other African countries you could source some of these things? And I think about the fact, when I was in South Africa, we were in Durban, and I never realized South Africa is a huge sugar producer. And there were tankers lined up off the coast of Durban just waiting to come in all day and load sugar. And then I go to Costco and they've got dried coconut with nothing added from Ghana. That's fabulous. So
Yeah.
in terms of thinking that through, are you trying to maybe move some of your other ingredients to other parts of Africa too?
Well, I think inter-African trade has a long way to go, partly from trade agreements and duties. And then also in some studies we were doing pre-MIA, sometimes to move something from a port in Africa, just inland in the country, is more expensive than getting it all the way there when they're talking about packaging that has to be brought in. So the transport's not so efficient. It can be very expensive for fuel. And so that's where the trade between African countries. But I think in West Africa, you have your best chance. But actually, if you make a chocolate, say in Ghana, of getting, cashews or other things from nearby countries. But Madagascar is also an island, which typically are quite expensive for imported items, just because it's an island. And, it has to go by sea and go through duties and all that, rather than just cross a border. So
I'm going to ask, there's a lot of questions. I'm going to ask one more now, then let you go through some of the chocolate making, and we'll come back to the others, so Rebecca is asking, are you seeing increasing demand for Madagascan beans? Are new farms springing up? Is there any impact on deforestation?
So I haven't, in all the time I've been around, and I haven't gone all over the cocoa growing region, but it hasn't changed much. It's about 6,000 tons a year. And that's about 1 ton per hectare generally. So it's pretty consistent. I think Madagascan cocoa is quite sought after, but the country has a somewhat unique position because it's so small that the really big companies wouldn't set up there, the massive cocoa traders, because it's just not worth it. It's 0.5% of the world's production. So even one cooperative in Ghana would be as much as the whole country of Madagascar, as an example. So I think the beans, for me, they're in demand. Where I see, at least, and Lauren, you can definitely come in here, but where there is an opportunity is in craft chocolate. There aren't many people who can get who are in the cocoa trade, first of all, but who can get out the really well fermented beans. So a lot of chocolate makers are sourcing from 1 or 2 plantations. So I think what would be interesting for Madagascar is if there was some kind of project or farmers unified and could get their beans out, because I think the industry's dying for other flavors, other stories of how people are working on the ground, because it's really hard as a craft maker to get, if you don't work in the country, you can't just buy a sack, you have to buy a container. And that's a lot of cocoa for a small chocolate maker.
I know there is a USDA program that the Fine Chocolate Industry Association is involved in, but it hasn't started yet. So I think the idea is to do more, because I think many of you know that most craft chocolate makers, as Brett said, are getting from the Aucassin farm. So that's one farm. And then you've got all these smallholder farmers. And I'm guessing that Aucassin may also be doing some collecting. I don't really know. But
one of the few that don't, that they do all from their own farm. There are other plantations I know do a mix, and they differentiate. But as far as I know, they don't. But they might have changed their approach.
No, you would know that better than me. All right, let's go ahead and talk chocolate making, and then we'll come back to some of the other questions.
So I would say, you saw where the farmers can go from selling fresh cocoa to actually adding value themselves. They could sell that to anybody. I think what makes what we do at MIA quite difficult at a lot of times, and also really fun and rewarding, is this part. So it's working with a local team to make the chocolate. So this is showing, so I'll just take you through this quickly and then we can have more conversation. But this is quality control. You can see they stick this in the bags. They can pull out 50 or 100 beans, and then they can do the cut test you saw earlier at the factory and see what the quality is. The sorting, you would have about, one person can do about 60 kilos a day, or one sack, about 130 pounds. And they get sorted again, at the factory for size, for foreign matter, mold, flat beans, that kind of thing.
Can I just ask a question, an economic question about that? So just to contrast it, if it was a big chocolate company, they'd be using machinery for this, right? Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the differences between this and that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is done manually, and I think I noticed this even when I lived in Madagascar. There are just certain things that make more sense in that setting, especially when you can create jobs. rather than importing. And some of these machines in coffee and chocolate and other, they can cost $250,000, $500,000 just for a machine. Makes sense if you're driving loads of volume and you work in, a country where it's just really difficult to have that done manually. I think in Africa, there's over 50% unemployment. So it's much better to employ people to do it, and people are eager to work. And, it's much more flexible as well because it doesn't break down. The other challenge working in Madagascar for any factory is that if something breaks, you're waiting for a technician from Europe or wherever the machine's made, and then you have this whole delay, which we've experienced this year, and I can tell you it's not so fun. So yeah, I think that would be how I'd answer it. Shall I go on? Yeah. So this cocoa is roasted about 130 kilos at a time in a coffee roaster. And one of the same makers, Probat, that historically made coffee roasters, sells a lot of cocoa roasters. It's very similar. Like fine coffee, fine flavor cocoa would get roasted, lower temperature, less time, just allowing the beans to develop, not burning them. And that is the end of what we call, that's kind of where you kill all the bacteria, and then it enters what we call the clean room in chocolate making, which is handled differently, separated. This shows the winnowing where they're breaking the shells, pushing them away with a fan. And that gets the nibs, which you see here behind the bar. I inserted this one because this is especially where I come in. So we'll work on the recipe with the chocolate maker, and then often we'll use a similar base recipe, and then we work on the inclusions with the team. So this is Josia, he's in charge of roasting and he does the inclusions. So we'll figure out how much salt, do them in Malagasy in English, the instructions, build the protocol, and over 3 or 4 days, then we kind of finalize the recipe. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is a roller. So this is more of machinery that's made typically in Switzerland. There's a very well-known maker, but some will have roller after roller after roller, and it'll just keep refining the chocolate down, and it can get silky smooth. This is just used for the first grind in Madagascar. Then it goes to, on the right is just a tank, a holding tank, but this would look similar to when it's just being mixed. This is a holding tank. On the left is the universal, what I'd said kind of looks like a jet engine inside and works horizontally, turning and turning. And then you can see there's the fan on the top, or sorry, the exhaust to get the volatiles out, the bad stuff. Do you have any questions, Lauren, before I go into the cold room?
From earlier, let's see. Bob wants to know where in Madagascar are your bars made.
So near the capital of Tana, or Antananarivo, just on the outskirts.
And I think we were pointing out earlier, I remember Brett once said it's up in the mountains, so it's cooler. A lot better place to make chocolate than down lower. Manali was asking if you have thoughts about making bars in other African countries. Just thinking of the name of your brand, she really appreciates the focus and intention of the in-country production.
Yeah, thanks. So we've been looking at it since day one, and we're currently looking at some West African countries and to see if we can do either chocolate or other products. So there's some interesting potential partners. So to clarify as well, what we do at MIA is we look to partner and basically facilitate more export for a local partner, improve the quality with them as we can, any food safety improvements that need to be made, and basically ensure that they're export ready, high quality. A lot of times the local market might not demand, you might have an artificial flavor of mango instead of real mango or something. So we look to elevate if they're doing that for MIA. And so that's our kind of, we're not building our own factories and doing it that way. We're doing it more with local partners. So it has its ups and downs, obviously, but the good thing is the capacity is there to some degree and the skills stay there, and we're just adding to what can happen.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead and keep sharing the chocolate making part, and we'll see if more questions come.
So the previous part was in normal temperatures, wherever it could be, a warm climate, cool climate. Now we're entering the cool room. So chocolate is kept at around, 70 degrees, I think, Fahrenheit.
And can I just say, I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges. No great surprise to this group here, but you're making this product in the country of origin where after the manufacturing process, it's perishable, right? But before it's not. And so then you've got electricity, and maybe you could talk about the costs of doing this part in country versus, say, doing it somewhere else.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think generally, the cost of electricity are higher because the means of production are not as cheap as they are at least in Belgium and the US. The complications are a little bit bigger because the electricity is not as dependable. I experienced that in Madagascar. Just remember working and then the computer starts beeping and the lights go off. And you're okay. So that makes it more challenging, more expensive. So the factory has to have a backup generator ready. That's obviously more expensive to use. Otherwise, I would say the process is quite similar, but it's a bit more complicated. And then once it goes on the truck, there's something connected to the truck to make the container cool. On the boat, the same thing. Those would be quite similar, even if you're exporting from Belgium or the US, if you're making chocolate. But I think it just makes it's just harder, to do this in Madagascar. Sorry, so this is the molds on the right. They're going into a tunnel that actually warms them so they can get as close to the temperature of chocolate as possible. Otherwise, when the chocolate drops on, it'll be shocked and it won't temper correctly. I skipped the tempering machine, but there's basically a machine that's developing the right crystals in chocolate. Chocolate has many different crystals. If you form the wrong ones, it could taste like sandpaper, and no physical change, just the crystallization inside. So this is a big step, and then it gets dropped into the molds. And it's amazing, working on product development here in Belgium. I've learned a lot about handling chocolate. I remember Lauren was doing that first time I met her, coming out of the back room, and it really crystallizes fast. So, when you get it right, in 20, 30 seconds, you can feel it start to firm up. On this line, the inclusions are either put in by hand, which is super impressive because they don't have much time, or they're dropped in from the top. So this lady's loading the sea salt and nibs into the depositor, which is like a machine crisscrossing and dropping a certain amount. Lady here is managing the cold tunnel, so she's just shifting bars over. So it's coming out of one section and going down. And then the lady on the right is demolding. You can't see the molds, but she would just tap them because the chocolate shrinking in the cold tunnel because the crystals are forming, and it shrinks and they just fall out. It's amazing. And that happens in space of, I think, maybe 5 minutes, this whole journey, 5-10 minutes. The other one, as you can see, is kind of semi-automatic. She's loading the chocolate bars that go down the belt and then into the Mia flow pack. Some people ask, why we don't use different packaging. One thing we want is we're trying to balance quality. So the flow pack is one thing that's not, there is some plastics inside this, but it's hermetic. So it's keeping the chocolate fresh and sealed in. So as long as it's in there, it's really helping to maintain the quality. And then they hand pack the bars into the Mia packaging, and then it gets loaded up onto pallets and out it goes. So that's summarizing the Mia journey. We have other resources as the conversation goes, so I'm just going to pull that up in case it's needed. But back to you, Lauren.
Well, and Brett, if you want to maybe unshare and just have us be you, we can end our conversation in the last few minutes with any more questions people have. This has been really great. And if anybody wants to turn on their microphone and ask a question or make a comment, feel free. Rebecca's asking, what is the bird symbol on the package?
That's a good question. And I was surprised nobody asked it for a long time. Now I've had it twice in the last month, so I'm happy. So we chose something that was African. So the pattern is actually inspired by modern Africa with the design partner. And then the bird comes from Ivory Coast. There was a king who was captured and he wore symbols as a sign of sorrow, and it spread to Ghana, and now it's used as in everyday life, marriages, funerals, and they have different symbols that they'll basically print on with a squash or a pumpkin kind of print. And these have meanings for them, and you actually see this. And so this bird actually means learning from the past to create for the future, or using the wisdom of the past to make decisions about the future. I thought it was very, how would I say that sums up Africa really well for me, because I think if there's anything I took from Madagascar is a respect for older elderly people and respect for their wisdom. And that's something I think you find all around, more traditional societies. And so we chose that for Mia. And also, we'd done something in chocolate. We were looking forward, so it kind of had meaning for us as well. So.
Well, good. Thank you, Brett. This has been really fabulous. Any last questions before we say our goodbyes?
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing. Your thoughtfulness that has gone into every aspect of it is so inspiring. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to share with us today.
No problem. Thank you. Yeah.
And
it was
Brett,
after 10 years of working. So I got to, the beauty of restarting is you get to restart, but then you realize how hard it is, till it's done. And you go, oh, that makes sense. Trust me, we had some funny names we came up with before Mia. We were like,
part of the fun is looking back and going, oh, remember when we came up with that name?
Yeah, we were like Savannah. And then you go to the trademark and you figure out 50 people have it. And then, it was right in front of us. And it was the designer's daughter's name as well. So it was like, how dumb could we all be?
Rebecca's asking, have you thought about using vanilla as a sweetener rather than sugar?
Yeah, that's actually very insightful. So yeah, vanilla does smooth things out and it makes it taste sweeter. I think for us, vanilla could do a lot in a higher percentage bar. I wouldn't want to put it in 100% because I think, as Lauren would attest, those people, most of them want pure cocoa. They don't want to have any doubt.
As Marjorie, one of my customers, used to refer to all inclusion bars as polluted, and she was the big 100% here. So.
Even inclusion bars are harder to sell to that crowd. So we do have it in our cashew ginger spice. That's my answer to everything today. Vanilla, nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger. And I think it could be really interesting in like an 85 or so if you wanted to soften it a bit and make it more approachable. But the cashew ginger spice, we did it with the cashews because they're higher in fat. So we ground it in with the cocoa to make it a little bit more approachable as a 75% chocolate.
Brett, your current model, so like, are you sustaining your current model of production, or are you expanding in some way, or do you have plans for the next year or two?
Yeah. So what I think within Madagascar, we would like to expand, and we're working on trying to actually work with we didn't talk much about the One for Change, but we work with the charity out of the UK, but they're on the ground in Madagascar. And so we're applying for a project between the charity, the chocolate factory, Mia, to give each party a chance to expand and get more into the market. But then the other way for Mia independently is to look at other supply partners. But it's, they're all big. I think the big difference is if you try an ingredient, from a country, you can pretty easily switch it up. But if you actually send out your packaging or print it there and send it to the factory, that's a huge investment. So we have to really go slowly and see, is it the right partner and are we right for them? Some people are not interested in working with other people. Some people are really open to it.
I have a question about, are the cashews in that bar, are they whole on the back, or are they chopped and dispersed, or how is that done?
Yeah, I would show you the bar. We ground them into the chocolate for two reasons. One is we want to make sure that people could taste it in every bite, and it's really hard with nuts to do that. Second is cashews are kind of a soft, fattier nut, so they don't really they can more easily sort of fade out, not like almonds that can stay crunchy. Like they don't give that crunch. And what we do have on the back is candied ginger. So we didn't try our candied orange bar today, but that's from Madagascar. There's a great local maker.
I had that one. It's excellent.
So there's candied ginger on the back. So our goal is that the cashew, I would say, is part of the bar for sure and part of the flavor profile, but it's not the standout. The standout is more the ginger, and just gives it a certain flavor. So.
All right, so we're going to end, but I have one last question that I think is a fitting way to end. Kim asks, what is the best way to continue to support your work and Mia, the brand from the US?
So I would say thank you, but really social media is an absolute challenge these days. So something completely free and hopefully can be fun for you is just follow things like them. We don't see it as a be all end all, but it is nice when people see it, that's all. We just want to spread the message. Buying the bar is great, but I would say even if you don't want to buy more because you don't eat a lot of chocolate, you're not into the craft chocolate world, is just telling people about Mia, telling people about craft chocolate. Because I think the more like what Lauren's done, and when we met, there were about 5 craft chocolate makers, and now there are 300 in the US. And
easily.
Literally. And then I moved to Europe and same thing started happening. So literally between the 2 years I left my previous company and started Mia, it was a whole different landscape in Europe, and really, you know, really lots of noise. So I'd say, yeah, tell people about it. And also, maybe this has nothing to do with Mia, and I know it's not easy because we don't even do it as a family on all of our food products, but the more, if you ask questions of the foods you buy, you'll learn more, and actually you'll get people to change. You know, you wouldn't believe, if people send a question or send an opinion, people really listen, especially small brands. So, and don't, you know, with Mia and others, don't hesitate to be, I would say, ask hard questions, you know, even if it feels critical, because that's the only way we know what people care about.
Well,
So,
thank you again, Brett. This has been really great. It's been great to catch up. Thank you to everybody for, as usual,
you.
great questions and your engagement.
Thank
It's
you.
really wonderful to have all of you here.
Mhm.
So thank you all. And
Have a
Brett,
good
happy
day.
evening.
Mhm.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.